Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 162, and just a little catch-up on what's been going on. The last couple issues where the storyline freezes over, which has John inside of a diner/bar during a blizzard, along with local people and a couple of criminals who are also seeking to get out of the blizzard. Of course, these criminals are threatening the people inside after a while because the regulars kind of figure out that these aren't good guys. So John has to use a little bit of magic, I think some suggestive magic, in order to get the upper hand on these guys. And eventually all the criminal guys die, and all the regulars and John are alive and well, and John can continue his trek through the United States, which is what he's on right now. I guess he's still on his way to Highwater, but it seems like he's taking the scenic route, so we'll have to see if he gets to Highwater in this next storyline. So first things first, with issue 162, we got the cover. We see John leaning against a brick wall that has a lot of graffiti on it, and the graffiti looks to be like a lot of punk iconography and also names of punk bands from the 70s and 80s. And John is leaning against that wall with his leather jacket that he's known to have worn when he was in the band Mucous Membrane, and he has a torn shirt on that has the name Clash on it, which is the name of a punk band. And he's smoking as always, looking out at us, looking pretty cool. But it's not just this cool look that we are seeing. There is something a little bit more ominous. On the bottom of the page, there is what looks like a dead person's arm sticking up in frame. And they're kind of surrounded by trash cans and stuff, so it's suggesting that John is smoking out in like an alley, and there's a dead body in the trash area. And we can also see on the cover that this is written by Brian Azzarello with art by Guy Davis. If you don't know who Guy Davis is, he is the normal artist on BPRD, which is the Hellboy spin-off title. And he was also one of the main artists for Sandman Mystery Theater, which is one of my favorite series from DC in the 90s. It's definitely a unique style that some people might not like, but I personally do enjoy it. And it usually works pretty well with either noir, like dark kind of stuff, or horror, which is pretty spooky and also dark. So as we turn to the first page, we see that John is arriving at a bus stop in Montana. So we're no longer in the South. Actually, I'm not 100% sure the last one was in the South. They didn't really say where Keith's bar was, but I just assumed it was the South. So anyway, as John's getting off the bus, he is of course pulling out a pack of cigarettes, opening it, pulling a cigarette out and lighting it and beginning to smoke. And as he does this, his narration says, "On the subject of traveling, I found there are two schools. One believes the destination is the point. Get to where you're going to and see what needs seeing to. Bollocks." And then we see as John takes his first puff of his cigarette, a security guard walks up because John is inside the bus depot, and he says, hey, buddy." And John stops and says, "Hey?" And the guard points to a sign that says no smoking, and he says, "Take it outside." And John doesn't look very happy about this, so he throws his cigarette on the ground in front of the guard, and he says, "You know, for a land that holds freedom so dear, it's surprising how little of it is actually tolerated." And then he walks away from the guard towards the front doors of the depot, and the guard yells after him, "Whatever, non-smokers have rights too." And John turns and says to him, "That they do." And then he turns back around and continues walking away, and as he walks out the front doors of the bus depot, he says, "Apparently one's held in higher regard than mine." And this is kind of funny because this comic is from 2001, so that is when all these smoking bans started to kind of happen in the US. Maybe some of them started earlier in different states, but I think by 2001, a lot of states had already banned it. So John does not like that because he is an avid smoker. So as John walks outside the bus depot, he of course lights another cigarette, and he's kind of walking on a sidewalk, and there's some homeless people. And I'm not sure which town in Montana this is supposed to be, but there was no signs or anything, so it just said "Welcome to Montana." So as John is lighting his cigarette, he's walking by a wooden fence that has a bunch of posters on it, and it seems like there's a bunch of band names. And as he stares at them, his narration says, "The other school of traveler tends to relish getting lost in the journey itself. That mad adrenaline rush brought on by all the wrong turns and unexpected discoveries along the way. If you haven't guessed, I subscribe to the latter. And as John's walking, one of the band flyers catches his eye, and he looks at it closer and we can see it reads Napalm Fucker, which I guess is a band, and there's a little anarchy sign drawn on it. And those words are over what looks like a picture of the Queen of England, but it's a little bit scratchy, so it's hard to tell. And John gets a little twinkle in his eyes and a smile on his face, and his narration continues saying, "After all, what is life if not a trip?" Then we turn the page and we cut to a flashback where we see a young John Constantine in his punk garb beating on a restroom door, and we can see a flyer on the door that reads Mucous Membrane with the same picture of the Queen. So I guess John's band Mucous Membrane also used that iconography in their posters. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Lapdogs and Englishmen Part 1. And I said John was wearing his punk garb, so it's pretty much what he was wearing on the cover with the jacket and the torn shirt, but he also has really spiky hair that's got these big fat points that are sticking up. So as he beats on this restroom door, he's yelling, "Open the fucking door there! Me molars are floating!" And we see another young guy walking up behind him smiling, and this guy's got the same hair as John, but he's not wearing a leather jacket. He's just got like punk bracelets that are black leather with studs on them, and then he's got a dog collar on with a lock on it. And this guy goes up to John and says, "Oi, John, it's getting late, and I'm not half pissed." And John pauses beating on the door for a second and says, "I hear you, Les, but before I down another, I gotta make room for it." Meaning before John can get drunk more, he needs to empty his bladder. And right as John says that, the door opens and whoever was inside, who's looking pretty surly at John, walks out. Les, John's friend here, beats John to the door and rushes in and closes it before John can get in. I guess just kind of playing a prank on John there. And this friend named Les is actually Gary Lester from Hellblazer issue 1, who was possessed by the demon Namoth, the demon of pestilence. So it's kind of nice to see him before he was like hooked on heroin and looking pretty rough. So when Les closed the door, he didn't lock it. So John comes in and yells, "You bastard!" And Les kind of just laughs as he unzips his fly and uses the only toilet in the restroom. And he says, "Care for a sword fight then, you bugger?" And John walks by him to the window that's open, and John decides he's just going to take a piss out the window. And he looks over to Les and says, "With a daft bloody ponce like you." And Les jokes, "You'll get no better." And as John situates himself in front of the open window, he starts to unzip his fly, and he says, "If I'm lucky, I think I'll just air it out a bit." But then as he looks out the window, he notices two people having sex in the alley behind the bar, just underneath where this window is. And they don't show John actually knowing that someone's there, but we can hear the man grunting as these people are having sex. And John doesn't seem to care at all. He just lets it go, and he begins to piss out the window, and he ends up pissing on the man's head, who is kind of behind the woman who's bending over a trash can or something in this alley. And we hear the man yell, "Oi, what the bloody hell?" And I guess Les has finished pissing because he comes over and he looks out the window and says, "What's that?" And John answers, "Seems I've rained on some lovebirds' parade." And then John and Les smile and look at each other, and they hear the man yell from down below, "I'm gonna fucking kill you!" And then John and Les run out of the restroom hysterically laughing. Then we turn the page and we cut to them at the bar, and Les is yelling to the bartender, "Oi, Danny!" So Danny walks over and Les asks, "Can we get a setup here?" And Danny looks at them and says, "You lads ain't playing tonight." And John confirms, "No." And this is pretty common in clubs. If you're playing that night, you get to drink at least some beers for free. But since they're not playing, Danny says, "Right, who's buying then?" And John and Les don't say anything because I think they were hoping that they would just get comped. But right at that moment, a young woman walks up and she's wearing the punk clothes just like John and Les. And she walks over to John and says, "Hello, John." And then John looks at her and then he looks back to Les and says, "Les, did I do something awful today?" And Les is kind of confused and he asks, "What you mean?" And now the woman is really close to John in his back, and she's trying to lean in to listen to what they're saying. And John is saying, "You know, like push a cripple down a flight of stairs or poison some poor dog." And Gaz, who kind of understands what's going on, says, "Not that I recall, no." Then John turns to the young woman and says, "Then tell me why is, in the middle of me having a smashing time, Angie gotta appear to cock it up." And Angie looks kind of hurt by that, but she stays where she's at next to John. And then Les takes out some money from somewhere, and he hands it to John and says, "This is the last of it, mate." And John says, "Very." But Angie cuts in saying, "I found it, John." And she's smiling at him and waiting for him to reply. And he just kind of tries to ignore her, not saying anything and just staring forward. I guess until it gets too awkward for him to not say anything. So he looks at her and he puts his head in his hand and says, "Bloody hell, Angie love. This is your stout then." Meaning he's going to make her pay for it. So she says, "Sure, all right." And she pulls out her purse and she pays for the drinks. And Les holds his up to her and says, "Cheers." And then he starts to drink it. And John picks his glass up and says, "Now, forced to pretend I actually care. Found what?" And she excitedly says, "The book." And John, who's much less excited, says, "Well, that's nice. If you teach yourself to read, it could be of some use." And she's not dissuaded by John's rudeness, and she says, "I'm not fooling around. I found it." And John snaps at her saying, "Let me guess. In a dusty used shop off an alley, the smell of rotting paper heavy in the air." And she looks at him with really big eyes like he just nailed it, and she says, "How'd you know?" And he rolls his eyes and says, "Christ." And Angie is still not dissuaded by his very rude attitude, and so she says, "It's the book, John." And now John has had it, so he kind of snaps at her and he yells, "The book? What bloody book? I swear there are so many fucking books. What does this one hold?" And her eyes get really big and she smiles and says, "The future." And then John grabs his pint, and as he's about to take another drink, he says, "The future, is it? Afraid you've been taken, you dotty bird. See, books, they only contain what has been. Never been one contains what will be." And then Les cuts in, "What about those with flying cars and jetpacks?" And then John smiles and looks back at him and clinks their glasses and says, "'Cept those. Cheers." But Angie reaches out and puts a hand on John's shoulder and says, "I told you about this book, John. You say a person's name, and it shows you their life. Chapter by chapter, you read their future." But John just looks at her kind of annoyed and really not wanting to be part of this conversation anymore. And as he's taking a sip of his pint, we see an angry young man walk up who's less punked out than the rest of them. It looks kind of like he's trying to be punk. He's got a loose tie around his neck and maybe some bracelets, but that's about it. And he goes to the bar right next to John and Les, and he says, "Fuck!" And John looks over interested and asks, "What's with you, Chaz? You arranged this meeting with the Yank who's been asking for me?" And Chaz, who's looking pretty angry, says, "Yeah, it's all set, and I'm fucking beside myself, I am." And John asks, "Why's that?" And Chaz answers, "I was in the alley giving it good and proper to Sheila when some bastard pours water down on us." And then John and Les look at each other and smile, and Chaz continues saying, "If I fucking catch him." But that's too much for John and Les to keep in, so they begin to laugh hysterically at the bar, and Chaz looks at them kind of mad and he asks, "What?" Then we turn the page and we cut to Chaz driving John and Les in his car. It's not a taxi yet, which is of course what it will become in the future. And John is asking him from the passenger seat, "So Chaz, what do you know about this Yank?" And Chaz answers, "Not much. Name's Stanley. Fancies himself a tough guy, but if you ask me, he's a bit of a poof." And then Les leans forward from the back seat and jokes, "No wonder he wants to meet you." And John looks back and says, "Ha fucking ha." And then he turns to Chaz and asks, "Chaz, why does he?" And Chaz answers, "Don't know. Said he knew you by reputation." And then John looks back at Les and says, "Maybe he heard our record." And then Chaz jokes, "Don't think he'd seek you out if that was the case." And John and Les look pretty sour at that joke. So John pulls out a cigarette and he asks Chaz, "How'd he get in touch with you?" And Chaz answers, "You know Hoover married down at Brick Lane?" And John asks, "The bird with no teeth?" And Chaz answers, "The same. Well, this Stanley character, he's snooping about for Curious, and he says your name. Says you should contact him. Be some money in it. Now Mary, she heard you and me are mates, so she rings me up. I ring him up, then I ring you up. I ring him back, and here we are." And right as he finishes his story, he parks right in front of a building that looks kind of like a warehouse. But there is a guard standing at the door underneath a light. And this guy looks pretty tough. He's got suspenders on and like a biker cap, and also a big mustache. And as John walks up, he lights a cigarette, and the man at the door looks at him and says, "You John Constantine?" And John says, That depends who's asking. But the man at the door doesn't have time for games, so he grabs John by his jacket and he pulls him up to his face and he says, yes or no? And John, looking kind of scared, says, Jesus, yes. And the door guy says, arms. And he kind of mimics what he wants John to do, which is hold out his arms so that he can do a pat down so he can check for weapons. And of course, John doesn't have any. And so the door guy lets him in and he says, go on. So John walks into this big warehouse where there's a white guy punching a punching bag, and he's wearing what looks like, I don't know, a tracksuit or something, and he's got boxing gloves on. And this guy is going to town on this punching bag. Like, he's huffing and puffing, and it seems like he's taking a lot of aggression out on it. And as John walks up, he finally gets to light his cigarette, and he says sarcastically, ever hit your back there, mate? And Stanley stops, and he looks back at John and says, never. And then he looks John over and he says, you're John Constantine. And John says, that must make you Stanley. Stanley. And he holds that out because he's waiting for Stanley to give him his last name. And Stanley looks at him and smiles and says, just Stanley'll do. And then he points to a bucket that's full of beer and ice and he says, I heard you like beer. There's a tub of it there on ice. Help yourself. So John, of course, walks over and gets a couple beers and he says, cheers. And then he turns back and says, so Stanley, what else you heard about me? And as Stanley wipes his face off with a towel, he says, I didn't search you out to bore you with your own life story, Constantine. Let's just say, you and we have similar interests. And John asks, do we? And Stanley confirms, we do. And then John holds up a beer to him, but Stanley puts out a glove and says, drinking's not one of them. Don't touch the stuff. And then John puts the beers on a table and he says, I'm going to have a difficult time trusting you. And as John says this, we can see Stanley unlacing his gloves, and then he holds his hands out for John to take them off for him, and he says, that's not what you're here for. And John questioningly asks, similar interests? And Stanley answers, exactly. What can't be known, but what we both know is there. And John teases, now, Stanley, what you don't know can't hurt you. And Stanley fires back, and what you do know can be used to hurt others. And this kind of intrigues John, so he says, I'm listening. And as Stanley massages his hands, he says, I want you to help me know the future. And then John puts his head in his hand and says, Jesus bloody Christ, the future again. And Stanley's a little confused and he asks, excuse me? But John just waves it off and he sits on the table and he says, nothing, mate, nothing. What if I told you of a book could show you the future? And Stanley looks at him not impressed and says, I'm not a novice, Constantine. Don't insult me. There's no such thing. I want the clock. And John really perks up at this and he says, do you know what you're saying? Because obviously he knows what Stanley's talking about. And Stanley answers, perfectly. And then John kind of mutters under his breath, the bloody clock. And Stanley says, yes, Rasputin's very bloody clock. My sources say it's here in London. And then John begins to pace around the room. And after he thinks for a minute, he says, has been, since after the Second World War is told. And Stanley gets very excited at this and he says, I knew it! I want you to get it for me! And he actually puts his hand on John's jacket, and John gets kind of offended by this and says, look, you nutter, if you think I'm about to go up against the Arab for some rich Yank schoolboy whose mom and dad sent him on holiday, but he's cut off because he realizes that he might have said the wrong thing to Stanley, and Stanley looks at him angrily and says, my parents are dead. And then he looks at John seriously and he asks, who's the Arab? And John answers, guess your sources can't tell you about someone who's seen to it he doesn't exist, can they? And then Stanley gets a big smile on his face and he says, you're afraid of him? And John says, without hiding it, bloody hell right I am. And then Stanley, seeing that John's kind of unsure and he might not take it, seems to decide something, and he says, I'll make it worth your while. And then John leans against a wall and he thinks for a second, and then he looks up and he says, say I agree. The future, Stanley, it don't come cheap. It's gonna cost you. And the look John has on his face is like he was waiting for this moment. Like he was waiting to raise the price or get the price that he wants from Stanley. So I think all of this about the Arab was an act, and it is definitely some kind of con he's playing on this Stanley guy. But Stanley doesn't pick up on that, so he walks over to John and says, One thing I already know about my future Constantine is I have more money than I'll ever be able to spend. Do we have a deal? And then he holds his hand out to John, and John shakes it. And then as John pulls out another cigarette, he says, "Give me a few days. I'll be in touch." And then he walks towards the exit, and Stanley, who looks pretty happy that he just said he was going to give John a bunch of money, grabs a water bottle and holds it up to John like he's toasting, and he says, "To the future." And John looks back and says, "Bit optimistic, ain't you, Stanley? I mean, you're assuming we'll have one." Then we turn the page, and we cut to a flat where we see Angie, the girl from the bar. She has this very large book on a table with some candles lit. And I don't think I described her in the bar, but I'll do it here. She has red hair that's probably dyed red because it's really bright, and you can see kind of dark undertones in it. And it is all spiky, just like everybody else's was at the bar. And she has fishnet gloves on and some leather bangles, and she's wearing a gray blouse with a green skirt. And she's looking very excited about having this book. And obviously, this is the book that she said would tell the future of anybody whose name you said to it. So she closes her eyes and opens the book, and she says the name, John Constantine. And immediately the pages begin to fill with John's future, and she opens her eyes, and they get very wide as she looks entranced down at the book. And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. So we'll have to wait until next time to see what happens with John's con job that he seems he's pulling, and also what's going on with Angie and this book. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains and comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.